morning. Many of you know that I'm from Oregon, which is a really different culture than it is here. And one thing that I borrow anything. They'll never borrow anything. They'll never put themselves in that situation where they feel like they're dependent on another person. Rather than, say, borrowing their neighbor's lawnmower, people are compelled to just have their own lawnmower. And if you don't like, if someone isn't a member of your family, you would never ask them to borrow anything. It's just the way the world works out there. Maybe it's like that here a little bit. I haven't lived here long enough to really know that. And so most people don't know their neighbors. They don't even know their neighbors at all. Don't know their names. They don't want to borrow a cup of sugar from them. They like the anonymity of our culture. They don't like anybody to meddle with their lives or look too closely at it. It's just the culture that I come from. And out in the West Coast, I think we like it that way. We like materialism. We like being independent. And we live like that's true. Plus, it's really convenient to just own everything that you might ever need. I'm using this example of a lawnmower because something simple like a lawnmower isn't something that every single person on the planet would need. You know, I bet 6 houses on my block over here could share a lawnmower, but we don't want to have to ask anybody to borrow a lawnmower, do we? There's something about us that likes not having to ask another person for anything. So rather than get to know our neighbors or put our trust in other people, we just make sure that our garages are so full that we'll never have to trouble anyone ever again. Ever. And this results in a lot of houses that have garages that are full of every tool that you would ever need. People fill their houses and the garages with stuff, and then when their houses get too full, then they build outbuildings to hold even more stuff. And in America, we have things called storage units, where for people who just can't even build another room to hold more of their stuff, they put their stuff in the storage unit. You know, storage units aren't the kind of thing that they had back in Jesus' day. They aren't the kind of thing they have in other parts of the world. That's an American thing. We're the only nation on the planet that cares so much, have that problem of having so much stuff that we can't house it all. We just have to hold on to it. We have to keep it somewhere safe. And so last week I told you we're working our way through the Quaker testimonies, which is kind of like a history lesson, but also it shows you these 4 ways that Quakers of old have tried to live out the gospel. And the 5 ways are simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. And this week is community. And last week when I was talking about integrity, I talked about how I had bought a car and I had a moral failing. You know, I lied to get this car. And then that car came to symbolize my betrayal of God, and I grew to hate that car. And as I was preparing to move to Kansas to go to Bible college, I wanted to get rid of that car. I've been wanting to get rid of that car for months, and I finally had the opportunity to sell that car and replace it with something maybe I had acquired a little bit more honorably. And so I sold it, and I bought that gray truck that many of you have seen me drive around. And it's just a gray Mazda pickup truck. But I knew I was going to be moving, and so part of me buying the truck was because I wanted to be able to carry more of my stuff. You know, I got to carry all my stuff with me halfway across the country. Because without my stuff to protect me from the cruel, harsh world, you know, how would I ever survive? And so I bought this truck. And don't get me wrong, I like trucks. I've driven a truck most of my life, and I kind of felt odd in a car. But I really wanted this truck, not just because I wanted to drag my stuff across the country, but I knew that I'd be moving away from my family. I'd be away from my resources and my connections. And I didn't want to have to ask anybody to help me if I needed a truck. That was the real reason that I bought that truck. That truck became a symbol of me striking out on my own and not having to need anyone. I brought that culture with me to Kansas, and it was pretty unnecessary, really. You know, I got to Kansas and lived in this little village, and I was so surprised when people, like 8 people, showed up to my house to help me move in. That wasn't something that I'd ever experienced before. People who would just show up and help you when you need it. People you wouldn't even have to ask for help. And as I started living in Haviland, Kansas, this little tiny village of a town of about 600 people, I started to realize that things worked a little bit different there. They had a truck. This old beater truck that had a Tommy lift on the back, and anybody could borrow it anytime they wanted. They had a wood shop that anybody from the community could use. And they shared their things in this village life. So in a village, especially one where people are preparing for ministry to be pastors and missionaries, these people had learned to depend on one another, to share their resources in ways that people back home had never even dreamed possible, perhaps. And many of us, as we read the book of Acts, this story about the early church sharing their resources, we import all these ideas. We think about modern views of world government, like that's what the Bible's talking about there. We read into philosophical questions about free markets and state-controlled markets, about personal property and communism. We read about the actions of the early church and we think, that doesn't sound very American, does it? And I think we do this at an expense to something that's truly great. We can go our whole lives acting like we're some character from a Clint Eastwood movie, you know, ruggedly independent, not needing anything from anyone. But when we think that way, when we go too far down that road, we just end up divorcing ourselves from really what it means to be the church. We miss what it means to be a community of disciples. I've been preaching my way through the Quaker testimonies, and the testimony of community isn't something that we talk too much about out there in Oregon, for obvious reasons that I've talked about my culture back there. And it's hard to put community in a box. It's hard to distill all the things that the Bible has to teach us about community. That's why I had to pick these 2 verses to try to kind of box this sermon in. You know, we see community in the raising up of Israel, the first people of God. We see community in Jesus calling his first disciples. We see it in the royal priesthood of all believers in 1 Peter. We see it in the great cloud of witnesses in the book of Hebrews. We see it in the people called together, the great multitude in the book of Revelation. All throughout the Bible, we see evidence of community, God calling a community into being. Sometimes, though, the local church is about the farthest thing from a real community that you can have. We can put on masks. We can sweep our sin under a warm blanket of denial. We can settle for a hi, how are you doing, fine kind of Christianity. Yet biblically, being a part of a holy community is a lot messier than we would like it to be. And it's full of starts and stops and failures. It's full of reasons to try to rely on one another and finding the disappointment of depending on another person and finding that they let you down. But part of that being a community is willing to trust people again after they've let us down. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wasn't a Quaker, but he was an amazing Christian who wrote so much about what it means to be a community. In his book on community called Life Together, he writes, "Let him who cannot be alone beware of community. Let him who is not in community beware of being alone. Each by itself has profound perils and pitfalls. One who wants fellowship without solitude plunges into the void of words and feelings. The one who seeks solitude without fellowship perishes in the abyss of vanity, self-infatuation, and despair." We might do well to ask ourselves as we talk about community, which side of this are our preferences on? Are we the kind of person who feels like we're constantly hungry for community, like we can't get enough of it to the point where we're losing a little piece of ourselves trying to join something bigger than ourselves? Or on the other side, are we the loner, like the Clint Eastwood figure, who shirks community at every possibility, avoiding anything that smells like a deep relationship? chances are, if we're coming to church asking what it is that we get out of it and whether or not it's worth it to us, we're missing something crucial about living in community. George Fox, an early Quaker leader, had this great vision about a people being gathered together. He was up on a hill and he had this vision and he saw this. He started preaching to people. And this vision became a reality. But his vision wasn't just the great cloud of witnesses from Hebrew. It wasn't this people to be gathered from the book of Revelation. It was a vision for his generation. And it was a vision that came into being as people were attracted to the message of Quakers and their fiery preaching. Quakers grew to 60,000 strong or something like that in the first 10 years. And so like the story of Jesus' parables that we had at our call to worship today, friends started out with a vision of expansion. Like Scott Biddle talked about a little bit in the early meeting. They found that the world was spiritually starving for the gospel of a God who was still speaking, who was still leading his people and calling them together. Like the early disciples who looked to one another's needs, the early Quakers did something very similar. They saw the needs around them and they met them. As Quakers were pulled into prison because of their religious persecution, they found that prison was a pretty terrible place. And over time, the Quakers transformed the prisons into something better. It's just what they did. The early disciples had figured out how to end poverty among themselves. So that scripture that we read talked about. There were no needy persons among them. They were one heart and one mind, willing to sacrifice their own personal property, their time, their talents, and their treasure to meet the needs of other people that God had called around them. To further sacrifice the work of God in their midst. And then the Quakers did that, just like the early church did. One amazing way that we see this is that when people felt called to serve in ministry, they would go on these like itinerant preaching things. They'd be gone for months, maybe even years. And the people of the community wanted them to live out the calling that they had put on, that God had put on their lives. And so they were willing to step up. They were willing to give them money to go on their travels. They were willing to take care of their farms and their families as they went. It's no surprise that the early Quaker movement was explosive. People were that willing to empower people who felt led and called. So the very fact that I'm serving as a pastor today is evidence of that sort of thing. This community has released me financially to serve in ministry. You guys pay so that I can do more of the work that I am called to do. But that isn't the end-all, be-all of what we're supposed to be as a church. Having a pastor or not having a pastor. That isn't all that God has imagined for his community of disciples. We're called to meet more than just my needs and the needs of my family. So we should be ever seeing needs around us and rising to the occasion of that. And I see this in so many ways. I see our more seasoned members, getting rides from people to church here today. There are people who can't make it out anymore, and people from this church who go and pick them up and bring them so they can be with us together in worship. It's amazing. It's a beautiful thing. I see it in people investing in the lives of young people. I see it in the community stretching ourselves to be more hospitable, even if that means a little bit more technology like our screen that we just recently got here. But are we a community that's really one heart, one mind? Do we really share with one another, not just from our hand-me-downs, but from our first fruits? Do we testify to the resurrection of Jesus with power to the point that we see God's grace so powerfully work in our lives that there are no needy people among us? I don't think we do. The early church did and the early Quakers did, but do we? And I think we have a lot of work to do, and I think this is groundbreaking work to do for us as a community. Marriage, when you commit yourself to another person in a relationship, you get the good along with the bad. Community is just like that. We pick who we invest in, we pick who we're together with, but we don't really get to pick who God calls to the church. It's like a family. You don't get to pick your family. God calls who he calls. And you can choose to be a part of it, or you can choose to not be a part of it. That's basically all the choice you have in that. Community is hard and it's messy. And as anyone who's tried to live in an intentional Christian community would know, you can't just keep hiding your junk. Eventually, you can't hide it. It's like you live in a glass house. It's going to come out. You have to deal with that in the community. The community isn't just this utopian vision free from squabbles. That's not what community is going to be. We might find our hands not wanting to let go of control. I love the Lego movie. Many of you have seen that. But there's this character in the Lego movie whose name is Lord Business. And there's this line that he says over and over again as he's justifying his actions of micromanaging everything about this world that he lives, this universe that he lives. He says, I just want everybody to stop messing with my stuff. You know? And I think the tension of that is alive and well. We can let people be creative, or we can try to hold things solid and crystallized in the form that we are familiar with and that we love. But in real community, we're more than just stuck in a me versus the world kind of mentality. Like a cluster of grapes cut off from the vine, we're going to wither and die. We might look good for a while, but it's all superficial. Without real community, there's not only no support, but there's no bigger purpose in our life outside of what we want, what we like, and what we dislike. Cut off from the mission of the church and a life with God, all we have really left is a bucket list. We don't have an adventure with God that's big enough to last the whole lifetime. One of the expressions of the testimony of community that I've seen back home is something called a meeting for clearness. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's an old Quaker thing. But basically, when someone felt like they were trying to discern God's will and make a major decision in their life, they would call a bunch of people together who they trusted, who were spiritually discerning. And they would come together, they would pray, and they would discern together what God's will for them would be. And these people would come, they would ask you questions, they would pray with you, they would try to listen with you to what God is saying. But I haven't seen too much of that out here. You know, I had something very similar just a couple of weeks ago as I was discerning whether or not I should teach a class of 10. But I haven't seen anybody else do anything like that as I got out here. And so, you know, this is a beautiful expression of ministry. It's a beautiful expression of the community. But I got to ask, why is it that we never see that out here? Is there something that's vastly missing from our community? Vulnerability, perhaps. Maybe trusting one another. Maybe our lives are so crammed with busyness that we have a community that's a mile wide but only an inch deep. True corporate discernment will forever be a pipe dream to people who can't love each other and spend time together and worship together and really be a body of believers in Christ. So we have a choice as to what kind of community that we'll have here at College Avenue. We can let our life speak in a way that testifies to the power of the gospel at work as alive and well in our community. We can perhaps reflect on how our lives reflect and fail to reflect the power of God in this way. We're called to be a community of disciples who make disciples. Sometimes I think we're more like a pile of Legos that are broken apart, laying on the floor, scattered around, just waiting to reach their full potential. So next Sunday, we have a real opportunity to be a community. I've been working with Jen Hammer to answer the call of preaching on her heart, and working with her as she's working on a sermon that she's going to preach right here next week. And we all before us have the opportunity to be a community to her, to really encourage her as she finds her way, to really trust that God can speak from her and to bring a listening ear to her as she tries to find her call. Or we could expect perfection. We could stifle the call of God on her life or come to her later and say, you know, it'd be really better if you did this and this and this and this and this. So, you know, I challenge you to think about that. Think about a community, because, you know, it's easy for us to just settle into doing everything the way that we want, our way, and to want this kind of perfection that only we can do, because we want it our way. But what we have to do in a community is pull ourselves back and let other people rise up to the place that they were called to be. And so that is part of being in a community, that we are each called to do. No matter what age we are, no matter what circumstance we are, we can't just do everything. You know what happens if we just do everything and do everything for everyone, and then we die? They're left completely powerless to continue. They have no idea what it is that we've been doing. We have to find all that out on our own. So the church is supposed to be a place where we bring others along, where we invest in them. We show them how to be who it is that God is calling them to be. And that's what I want. That's what God wants here. He wants us to be one body, one heart, one mind. He wants us to work together to reach the world with the gospel. And so as we try to do that together, reflect on your part in that. I have some queries I want to put up. Quakers, if you're new here, Quakers have long used queries. They're the kind of questions that we use to check in on our relationship with God and see where it is that we're at. And so as we go to this time of local worship, which is a time of listening to God, use these queries to help you find your way, especially if you're new to that. If you're, we feel that God is still listening and feel that God is still speaking, and that at times He can use anyone, not just the pastor on the stage, but anyone. So as we go into this time of open worship, we feel that God is laying something on your heart, stand, and someone will bring a microphone to you, and you can share what it is that God has laid on your heart. It's another testimony